Surveillance state Stasi, and no dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials and the Millennial. Joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, who's on the other side of the camera. He is our producer. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us at Mark and the Millennials. This podcast, Surveillance State Stasi. It's going to be kind of interesting because we have some clips about this and some proof of what's really going on. And there's very little media attention given to this issue. All we hear is January 6th, January 6th. But what we don't hear is how our government has what appears to be, in my opinion, a secret police. So first up, in the Epoch Times, the January 6th electronic surveillance unit was illegal, says Representative Gomert. Attorney suggests entrapment. As previously reported in an exclusive June 20th report, evidence proves that plainclothes members of a special electronics surveillance unit, or ESU, I love the way the government uses these acronyms, were embedded among the January 6, 2021 protesters for the purposes of conducting video surveillance. According to experts, one believes the activity itself may have been against the law. The other contends it was done for the purpose of entrapment, which, by the way, makes a lot of sense to me, the entrapment part. Against the law, speaking as a former prosecutor and three-term district judge, Representative Louis Gomert, Republican of Texas, told the Epoch Times, if you are going to have electronic surveillance of people, there has to be warrants. As Gomert explained, FISA courts have granted warrants with no particular clarity and no probable cause that a crime has been committed or that this person engaged in a crime. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISC, was established under the 1978 Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Pursuant to FISA, the FISC website explains, the court, quote, entertains applications submitted by the United States government for approval of electronic surveillance, physical search, and other investigative actions for foreign intelligence purposes. Regarding domestic electronic surveillance, the Department of Justice says on their website, quote, because of the well-recognized intrusive nature of many types of electronic surveillance, especially wiretaps and bugs, and the Fourth Amendment implications of the government's use of these devices in the course of its investigations, the relevant statutes and related Department of Justice guidelines provide restrictions on the use of most electronic surveillance, including the requirement that a high-level department official specifically approve the use of many of these types of electronic surveillances prior to an assistant U.S. attorney obtaining a court order authorizing interception. In other words, they need to get permission from a court before they can actually surveil you, including surveilling you in public. Okay? Obviously, surveilling you in private, that is to say, in the privacy of your home or in the privacy of someone else's personal or private property. But this also includes in public, ladies and gentlemen. Quote, we can't have secret units doing secret surveillance of people that have committed no crime, no probable cause of a crime, just getting blanket surveillance, Gomert asserted. We don't know what kind of warrant they had, or even if they had warrants. But to deploy electronic surveillance units tells us there's a lot more here that we need to find out about. And obviously, it's not going to be uncovered at least for another 6 months. And his point is another 6 months, meaning after the Republicans take control of Congress, in which case then and only then can we have real investigations into why it is that there are so many people who were embedded in the January 6th protests, and who knows, probably even before, who were encouraging people who were there and peacefully showing their support of Donald Trump, encouraging them to break in to the Capitol. Now, think about that. You're being surveyed, and at the same time, you're being entrapped by the same people who are surveilling you by telling you, hey, break in there. Come on, we got to go in there and show them who's in charge. And they had a bunch of these people doing this, and they've all kind of like disappeared. So Louis Gohmert, Republican of Texas, added that, quote, there is more information we haven't gotten and information that continues to leak out, drip by drip. Like this in the Epoch Times, Gohmert noted, pointing out how until the deployment of munitions, the crowd was peaceful. I had heard from people and seen people interviewed saying there wasn't any violence out there. We were just mulling around chanting stuff from time to time. Then they started firing on us with tear gas and provoked the crowd. They created chaos, and you just got to wonder what was going on. So the article continues, as I'm sure you can imagine, in the Epoch Times. As I said, ladies and gentlemen, there are very, very few news outlets willing to actually provide any kind of useful information, let alone just like even ask the questions, right? Because isn't that uniquely American? You ask questions. You say, okay, so this group of people were in the Capitol illegally. They were trespassing. But then there were these people who were outside who were encouraging those people to break in. To that, you ask the question, why weren't those people spoken to? Because maybe they actually were, feds. Maybe they were part of the surveillance state Stasi. Now, you've heard allegations of this, folks, but what is missing here is the lack of reporting, the just sheer lack of interest or reporting by the press as to a government and a branch of the government, in particular the FBI, that might have a surveillance state Stasi that I think kind of probably does. And isn't that weird? I mean, wouldn't you find that incredibly scary that you could be surveyed and you could have surveillance on you, and the person is doing this over a period of many months, who knows, maybe even longer. And at some point, you do one thing, right? You do that one thing wrong. And that one thing is just a tiny little thing, right? I don't know, make something up. I know you threw a piece of trash on the ground, which is, you shouldn't litter, of course. But who knows, right? A federal government that is trying to play gotcha and entrapment that is not the function of government. That is the function of authoritarian governments. That's the function of communist governments. That's the function of dictatorships. And now we have a secret police that works for one party. And that secret police works for the Democrat Party, because the Democrat Party and leftists across the world throughout history are the ones that always had a Stasi. So get this, in headline USA News, ex-Trump advisor sounds off on the Stasi raid authorized by the J6 committee. So before sunrise on June 22nd, FBI agents forced themselves into the home of a Trump administration official who described their tactics as highly politicized and Stasi-like. Now, ladies and gentlemen, listen to this carefully. This wasn't just like somebody out there who broke into the Capitol during January 6th. Listen to this. This is former Justice Department Assistant Attorney General Jeffrey Clark. He's an Assistant Attorney General, and he was in the U.S. Department of Justice under Donald Trump. He served in the Environment and Natural Resource Division from 2018 to 2021, recounted the raid during Tucker Carlson Tonight just a few days ago, and he talks about how the FBI just broke into his house and were trying to find all kinds of electronic devices, I suppose, because they're assuming or they're saying potentially that this guy somehow was part of the insurrection. It's just, so what do? They just lawlessly, the Stasi, the FBI, the Stasi, break into his house. This, by the way, this is a law enforcement official, okay? A very high-level law enforcement official that rather than just bringing him in and having a conversation with him, which they never did, they just decided to break into his house. And the dude is in his pajamas. We have 2 clips on this. Here is the first clip. Here it is.
Just before 7 a.m., there was loud banging at my door, insistent banging. So I just rushed down as fast as I could. I quickly figured out, that there were agents there. I opened the door and asked for the courtesy to be able to put some pants on, and was told, no, you got to come outside. So I came outside. They swept the house. Eventually, they let me go back inside and put the pants on. But then, by my count, at one point, 12 agents and 2 Fairfax County police officers went into my house, searched it for 3.5 hours. They even brought along something, Tucker, I've never seen before or heard of, a electronic sniffing dog. And they took all of the electronics from my house. I don't blame the agents. I think what you're talking about in terms of weaponization is really about who's pointing the agents and telling them.
So weaponization of government, which we've talked about before in Mark and the Millennials, but there's a big difference between weaponizing a certain department in the federal government and then weaponizing the FBI to act like the secret police or the Stasi, which is what's happened to this gentleman who was a former assistant general in the U.S. Department of Justice. It's just that he's on the wrong side, right? He's a Republican, so therefore he's the bad guy. And this is where we are in the United States of America today. This gentleman continues, by the way, you just heard they raided his house. He was in his PJs. There are electronic sniffing dogs. Have any of you out there in Mark the Millennials ever heard of look, we know that dogs have incredible sense of smell, but now the FBI has electronic sniffing dogs. What the heck? Is anyone out there concerned about the well-being of our country when you have this surveillance state capability? If you have the capability, then you also are going to have a government that is naturally going to try to abuse the capability. Private citizens might try to abuse it as well, but certainly the government, because the government has endless amounts of money to buy the equipment and to abuse it. So we also have the same gentleman. This is the same gentleman, the former Assistant Attorney General of the United States of America that dealt with environmental matters. And we have the second clip in this series, and here it is.
I just think we're living in a era that I don't recognize, and increasingly, Tucker, I don't recognize the country anymore with these kinds of Stasi-like things happening.
No, so very good. Call them Stasi-like things. And if that isn't enough, in the Epic Times, not that we're making the connection, ladies and gentlemen, but former Senate Sergeant at Arms Michael Stenger, in charge of security on January 6, dies at age 71. He resigned at the request of Senator Mitch McConnell. So Michael Stenger, the former U.S. Senate Sergeant at Arms who was in charge of Senate security during the breach of the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, died on June 27th. The circumstances and cause of Stenger's death were not immediately clear. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican Georgia, posted on Twitter that Stenger was found dead today. Stenger, 71, of Falls Church, Virginia, resigned the day after the Capitol Police, at the request of then Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who hired Stenger for the post in April of 2018. Stenger served as the 41st Sergeant at Arms of the U.S. Senate. The Sergeant at Arms is the chief law enforcement, protocol, and executive officer for the U.S. Senate. The Sergeant at Arms is responsible for security in the Capitol and all Senate buildings and serves as the Senate doorkeeper. In remarks before a congressional hearing on February 23, 2021, Stenger called the events of January 6 a violent, coordinated attack where the loss of life could have been much worse. He called for an investigation of professional agitators at the January 6 protests. I'm going to read that again. Stenger called for an investigation of, quote, professional agitators. What is a professional agitator? You make up your own mind. Quote, there is an opportunity to learn lessons from the events of January 6th, he testified. Investigations should be considered as to funding and travel of what appears to be professional agitators. So this is interesting, ladies and gentlemen, because he didn't just intimate, he said, Stenger did, in testimony, that there were people that came in to Washington, D.C. from outside the area who you would think what he's saying, maybe not necessarily Trump supporters, but trying to get Trump supporters in trouble. Yeah. And then this guy dies. The former sergeant at arms just passed away yesterday. And obviously we wish his family well. We're very sorry this happened to him. But now you no longer have someone who probably has a lot of secrets. Just saying. I'm not saying this is the gentleman that was part of the Stasi. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, I don't believe that. I'm saying he probably knows a lot and mysteriously passes away. You can draw your own conclusions, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not saying that they're connected. Draw your own conclusions, though. Kind of seems weird. The other thing that's interesting, too, and Christopher Hopkins knows this about us, is in the Maryland legislature, rarely talk about this, the legislature that I serve in, we actually put a bill in. I think it was House Bill 1202. It was a couple of years ago. And 1202 was the bill that had facial recognition technology. Maybe you can text that to me because it'll come up on my screen. But basically what this bill did was, and I want to talk about this because it goes to the Stasi, it goes to the surveillance state. The bill, and it passed, and it's law in Maryland, basically says that if you go for an employment interview, okay, you're sitting in the office, you're being interviewed, or you're being interviewed by Zoom, via Zoom, that your employer can't use facial recognition technology to be able to identify you and find out other things about you without your consent. And your consent must be in writing. So what does that mean? It was at 1202? You sent it? Okay, good. So what that means is this, ladies and gentlemen. It means that when you go for an employment interview, you want to make sure that your employer at least tells you, hey, look, we're using facial recognition technology, and we just want to make sure it's okay with you. So what can they do with that? Oh, everything. Let's say if you have a bunch of profiles that you put out there on social media, and they determine, oh no, this guy's a Republican. We're going to not hire him because he's a Republican. Or we're not going to hire this guy because he doesn't have an electric car. He doesn't have an EV. So therefore, he's not one of us. I mean, you can make up a million different reasons of why they won't hire you based on using your facial recognition technology, identifying exactly all of your social media accounts, pulling all that information in, getting this big report, and determining that they're not going to hire you off of things that have nothing to do with the reason that you applied for the job. And literally blackballing you and making it impossible for you to get a job. So I put this bill in and the bill passed. And you know why it passed? Because I knew Democrats, they hate companies and they're like, oh, good, we're going to regulate companies even more. That's why they passed it. But what they didn't realize is this bill opened up a door, a very, very important door, a door that must be opened completely and wide open, whereby we intend to add to this bill little by little each year, a bill that should also include what else? The federal government. Okay? Because that's really what we want to do. We want this bill to apply not just to the private sector. We want the bill to apply to the public sector. We want the bill to apply to government so that when you go into an employment with the federal employment opportunity with the federal government, that they also can't use facial recognition technology. And then we want to expand this to what? The use of facial recognition technology in open areas and public areas. Because isn't that surveillance? Isn't that part of the surveillance state? And I know what you're saying. You're saying, well, isn't there a fine line? I mean, shouldn't you even have to have the right to be able to find out who's out there just in case if there's a terrorist or something like that? Look, I get it. I get it, ladies and gentlemen. But aren't you right now more afraid of the FBI and the Stasi than you are the terrorists? Because I am. I'm more afraid of our own government. And I'm afraid of their use of this technology and misuse of the technology. So what we did in Maryland, and by we, I mean me and Chris, is we put this bill in, and House Bill 1202 in Maryland. And it was, what was the year that this was put in, Chris? 2019?
I think 2020.
Is it 2020? And the bill was put in 2020, and it passed. And effectively, what the bill does is say, hey, look, if you go into an employment interview with a private company, then that private company can only use facial recognition technology services if you consent to them doing so during the interview. And the consent must be in writing. And you have to understand what that even means. And I think that's important. It's a 2020?
Yeah.
So it's 2020. House Bill 1202, 2020.
Right before the pandemic.
And so it's interesting because I got a little criticism, a tiny little criticism from a couple of colleagues, not the brightest bulbs, to be honest with you, on our side of the aisle, the Republican side of the aisle. And I said, do you understand what we just did? We just opened the door for the first time, a door that requires one group, and hopefully we're going to add group after group after group, to telling you that they are actually surveilling you. They are actually using information about you without your consent. They are actually collecting information about you without your consent. And it's important, ladies and gentlemen, that we continue to expand this, and we see this with the raid of this Assistant Attorney General in the United States of America, where the FBI, they have a secret police division now, apparently they don't call it that, but they go in and they raid someone's home who's a law enforcement official because he's allegedly hiding a bunch of stuff about the January 6th insurrection, an insurrection, ladies and gentlemen, as the FBI and the Democrats call it, that may actually have been what? Instigated by the FBI. Think about that. So one of the reasons, and by the way, the bill that we put in was put in prior to the January 6th event. So, but I knew that this was an issue because I remember going into Washington, D.C., and it wasn't January 6th, I'm just telling you, but it was years before because we live right outside the city. And I remember noticing that there are cameras everywhere, you know, like everywhere. And they're on public property. I mean, they're everywhere. And you got to say to yourself, whatever happened to good old fashioned policing, right? You have an actual body out there of a police officer. Isn't that better? And granted, maybe the surveillance state cameras are cheaper, but it's a lot scarier. Because then once you allow that as a civilized society, it means you allow it everywhere, everywhere. And there's nowhere that there isn't a camera. And I know what you're saying is, well, it's too late. That ship has sailed. No, folks, it's not too late. It's not too late. And since there is a secret police in the FBI, and we know that this is the case without question, and we're going to find out a lot more in about 6 months when the Republicans take over Congress, thank God, about what's really happening in the United States of America. Once we do that, we're going to find out all of the information, and we're going to make sure that we correct it. And we should start passing legislation once and for all that makes it possible for us to know that this never will happen again. So next up, podcast listeners, abortion tourism. Yes, abortion tourism. Companies that vow to cover abortion travel costs silent on helping mothers pay for baby formula. It's in the Daily Caller. So 14 companies that vowed to cover the cost of travel for a woman's abortion could not name a company-wide benefit or initiative to the Daily Caller that helped employees pay for baby formula amid a nationwide shortage. Companies including Yelp, OkCupid, Alaska Air, Lyft, Facebook's parent company Meta told the Daily Caller that they offer a litany of wellness and health care benefits to employees, including covering the travel costs for an abortion. However, none of these companies could provide a concrete example of how they are helping current mothers obtain baby formula amid the nationwide shortage. Yelp referred the Daily Caller to a statement from the company's co-founder and CEO, Jeremy Stoppelman, who claimed the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade puts women's health in jeopardy. This ruling puts women's health in jeopardy, denies them their human rights, and threatens to dismantle the progress that we've made towards gender equality in the workplace. Since Roe, business leaders must step up to support the health and safety of their employees by speaking out against the wave of abortion bans that will be triggered as a result of this decision and the call on Congress to codify Roe into law, Stoppelman said on Twitter. A spokesperson for Yelp told the Daily Caller that the company implemented a caregiver reimbursement to be used towards expenses like the cost of a babysitter or nanny, educational courses on safety for families, or lactation classes. Yelp employees also have access to a therapy platform for themselves and dependents age 13 plus. But Yelp could not list an initiative in participating in to help employees find baby formula. OkCupid spokesman Michael Caine told the Daily Caller that the company's health care plan covers, quote, travel and lodging costs for any employees who need to travel out of state to receive care, and helps cover adoption and surrogacy fees for same-sex and all couples. Kay could not list an initiative to help employees find baby formula. And this, by the way, just went on and on and on with all of these companies. Look, it's kind of fascinating because I know that all of you out there in podcast land see the protests of the left, and the extreme left, who are protesting of all places in front of the Supreme Court, saying the following: women are not going to be able to get abortions. Women are not going to be able to have reproductive rights, and just all of these things, by the way, which are not true based on the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Why are they not true? Well, they're not true. And by the way, all of you out there, you see those protests. What I see is a bunch of idiots who are completely and utterly uninformed about the American way of government and how it's supposed to operate. It's like why we need to bring back civics, and we need to like really test people so that they understand how our system works. All the Supreme Court did was it overturned Roe and then batted this back to the 50 states. All of those 50 states will then decide what is best for the states. And the people will elect representatives in those states who will do their will, which is the way it's supposed to work. But we have the left saying, no, elected officials in our republic who are elected by the people should not have the right to vote to make law in their respective states. Instead, it should just be the courts. So what I see is a left that is utterly ignorant about the way the American system of government is supposed to work. Most people just see the protests and they're like, yeah, whatever. It's just the left protesting once again. And one of the things one observation, bear with me on this. It is kind of funny. One observation about the left is in front of the court right after the ruling, there was this very large woman who had painted on her shirt and also painted on her buttocks, I vote with my vagina. Now, can you imagine, someone, it's just like, why not just talk about the issues of abortion? Why not talk about the scientific aspects of life and stick with that, right? But they can't.
Do women have vaginas now?
That was my first thought too. It's like, I thought women didn't have vaginas, but she said, I vote with my vagina. So I told my very good friend this observation. I said, just to show you how crazy they've gotten, there's a woman that has a shirt, and on her pants, she painted, "I vote with my vagina." And he said to me, his response was, well, that's a good argument for voter ID. Think about that for a moment. But Chris is right. Our producer, Chris, our millennial, is right. Suddenly, Democrats believe women do have vaginas. But prior to Roe v. Wade, women did not have vaginas. At least if you were a Democrat, right? You could be a man could be a woman, and you could give birth if you're a man. I mean, they really believe this stuff, ladies and gentlemen. And I have to say that they have lost their minds again. Here's an example. Also in the Daily Caller, White House dismisses Senator Elizabeth Warren's idea of putting abortion clinics in national parks. Can't make it up. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre on Tuesday dismissed Democrat Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren's idea of putting abortion clinics in national parks. Warren, during a Monday interview with the Washington Post, suggested the Biden administration develop Planned Parenthood tents along the edges of national parks. The suggestion came in the wake of the Supreme Court's ruling to strike down Roe v. Wade. So we're calling this segment Abortion Tourism because literally that is what Elizabeth Warren wants. People go to parks because they are on vacation. They are tourists, especially the national parks. Elizabeth Warren wants tents, right on the national park's edge so that you go there to not camp, not hike, but to get an abortion. I mean, it's just so sick. And then you have protesters vandalizing and firebombing pro-life centers across the country as a result of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. But what's interesting is the Stasi in the federal government, the FBI, nowhere to be found. Nowhere to be found. Oh, no, they're hyper-focused on what? They're hyper-focused on January 6th. January 6th. They're not concerned about buildings being blown up by terrorists who are domestic terrorists. No, they're concerned about people who broke into the Capitol because they're calling it an insurrection. An insurrection that, as we know, there's a lot of information about this insurrection that leads to the FBI itself as being potentially the perpetrator of the insurrection, if you want to call it that. I mean, it's not an insurrection. It's wrong to break into buildings, okay? That's trespassing. And it was wrong. Everybody agrees with that. But the fact of the matter is that we have individuals who are blowing up abortion clinics or firebombing them or defacing them. And these are actually pregnancy centers, to be clear, centers that convince women to keep their children and to encourage them to do so. And these are the places that are being firebombed. It's just really weird stuff. I mean, and then we have the Assistant Secretary of Health of the United States of America. Speaking of the fact that these folks don't believe women have vaginas, we have this Assistant Secretary. What happened? What did you send me? Representative Jim Jordan. Hard for Americans to care about the sham January 6th committee when they can't afford to fill up their gas tank, buy groceries, or take a summer vacation with their family. Yeah, very true. It's a good one. So the Assistant Secretary of Health of the United States of America, an appointee of Joe Biden, said that, and that's Rachel Levine, of course, he says, sex reassignment surgery for kids is life-saving, medically necessary. So keep in mind, We were just talking about the Roe v. Wade decision and how Democrats are saying women can't get reproductive rights. And another woman that's there saying she votes with her vagina. Now we have the Assistant Secretary of State of the United States of America saying, well, you can be a woman and not have a vagina. So we have a clip on this. Remember, Rachel Levine is a dude, and Rachel Levine is the Assistant Secretary of State who was previously a pediatrician. A pediatrician, right? In other words, treating children. So this pediatrician believes that you give in to children. We have the clip, and here it is.
Gender-affirming care is life-saving, medically necessary, age-appropriate, and a critical tool for healthcare providers. As a pediatrician, when it comes to making sure kids are healthy and happy, I know how important care that affirms someone's true identity can be.
So I know how important it is as a pediatrician in K-12 for you to be able to say that you're actually the opposite sex from your biological sex. Literally, that is what this individual believes. Dr. Rachel Levine has said this again and again. It's completely contradictory to the Roe v. Wade ruling, where Democrats are saying, you're attacking women. I mean, these people are crazy. They've lost their minds. So I want to get this straight. As a father, how many times, or mother, moms and dads out there, and I'm just going to speak for myself as a dad, I can't tell you how many times I would take my kids out places, and you would go, let's say, to a 7-Eleven, just as an example. And they would say, and your kid was, let's say, 5 years old. Happened because I have 3 children. And the kid would say, hey, Dad, I want some candy. You're like, nah, no candy today. You know, I just bought you a Slurpee. You know, you're not having candy. No candy. So you're able to say no to your child because it's a child. But when you say, your kid says, you know, Dad, I want to be a girl, or Dad, I want to be a boy. So in other words, they want to change their sex. You're supposed to say, according to Dr. Rachel Levine, oh, that's okay, honey. You can change your sex. You just can't have candy. I mean, that's literally what Dr. Rachel Levine is saying. That a child can make the decision as to what is best for them as it relates to their choice of their sex. And so what else should a child be able to make a decision about? Well, if a child can make a decision about what kind of sex they can be, what sex they can be, then can a child also make the decision, like 11-year-old also make the decision about, or 10-year-old or 5-year-old about having sex? I mean, literally, that's what this is all heading to, ladies and gentlemen. We know this for a fact, okay? Anytime you have an entire party, a Democrat party, all in on getting involved in people's sexual lives in K-12, children, you know it's not going to end well. And that was Chris in the background. It's like, it's just insane. Absolutely insane. So you have to understand, this is the Assistant Secretary of Health of the United States of America saying this. A former pediatrician. It will not end well for our country unless we fight back. So next up, podcast listeners, Carrie Lake roasts a CNN reporter. That's right. Carrie Lake, ladies and gentlemen, is a candidate for governor of Arizona. And she gives a brutal message to a CNN reporter. So Republican Arizona gubernatorial candidate Carrie Lake had a brutal message for CNN senior national reporter Kyung La outside of an event. La appeared outside of the event where Lake shook her hand and pointed out that she is not wearing a mask anymore, according to video Lake shared Thursday on Twitter. So I have to set this up. So La is the CNN reporter. She's Asian American, and she walks up to Carrie Lake, who's running for governor of Arizona. Carrie Lake, the Republican candidate. And so La walks up to her, and, you know, it's kind of sort of an ambush, and starts asking Carrie Lake a question And as you all know, most Republican candidates that are out there, at least until Donald Trump, most Republican candidates, for the most part, were gracious with the press. You know, they would push back a little, but they would always let the press get away with misrepresenting quotes and trying to play gotcha with questions. And Trump stopped that because he would basically say, "Oh, you're just a hack for this group or for that group, and you're just giving me these gotcha questions." Now, maybe Trump took a little bit too far, but let's face it. One thing is certain. Trump outed the press's bias. He was the first president of the United States, the first Republican to truly out how incredibly crooked and biased the press has become. And actually, that is so dangerous for our country. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you have a new person that's out there who's done the same thing. We have a clip of Kari Lake speaking to Kyung La of CNN. You're going to love how this ends. We have the clip, and here it is.
Hi.
Carrie.
Hi.
Nice to see you. Kyung La from CNN.
You don't have a mask on anymore. What's going
we're
on?
outside. Do you have a minute to
well,
chat?
we're 6 feet apart.
Do you have a minute to chat?
I'll do an interview.
Okay.
As long as it airs on CNN Plus. Does that still exist?
Yeah.
I didn't think so, because the people don't like what you guys are peddling, which is propaganda. Thank you.
That's involuntary servitude.
So the CNN reporter, her last name is La. You should have seen her face. Her face was like, oh my gosh. I mean, she was just bewildered because she had just been roasted, absolutely roasted by Kari Lake. And also, what do you say? Like, you're working for CNN, a company that's literally going belly up, and one part of CNN, their streaming service, and keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that streaming services like Netflix and Peacock and Amazon, I mean, this is where TV and video has been going for quite some time. And CNN is like the one company that can't even make it as a streaming service. So they cancel their streaming service after investing $500 million. They're barely even operating now on cable. I mean, hardly anyone watches them. And Kari Lake just roasts the CNN reporter. And the CNN reporter is just speechless, literally speechless. Is like, I mean, that's what Republicans need to do more of. They need to indeed provide interviews to the press. That's very important. We need that. But we also need the press to be called out when they are crooked. And we should do that reporter by reporter. And so at CNN, I really don't know any reporters at CNN who are fair, balanced. Any reporters at CNN who ever criticize the left just doesn't happen. And so I think that's fair game for Kari Lake to do that. But I also think more Republicans need to do this as well. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, that includes calling out Republican outlets, you know, conservative outlets or outlets that are to the right of center, like Fox News, although I doubt sometimes what Fox News really is. But when they make a mistake, when they're unfair, when they're crooked, when they're doing things that you disagree with, call them out for sure. So Kari Lake did an amazing job doing this. We need more of this. I think what it does is it gets the conservative base excited when they see candidates that want to fight. And I think this is the one thing that so many moderate Republicans, mind you, have lost. They don't understand, moderate Republicans, that is, that the reason Donald Trump became so popular was because he was willing to fight. He was willing to fight every battle. And one of the greatest battles of the 21st century is the battle against a very crooked press, a press that is corporate and truly been co-opted by big, huge mega companies, as well as maybe, to a certain extent, China. Okay, notice I didn't say Russia, because it seems so often to me that CNN is so invested in making money overseas that they're willing to throw the United States of America, where CNN is based, their corporation is based here, they're willing just to throw our country under the bus. So next up, podcast listeners, 1 million voters switch parties. In the Epic Times, over 1 million voters switched to the GOP in a warning for the Democrats. At least 1 million voters across 43 states have switched to the Republican Party in the past year alone, according to analysis released by the Associated Press just yesterday. The AP said that it compiled ballot intentions to make the finding, noting that the shift is happening more frequently in the suburbs. Ha-ha! Over the past year, far more people are switching to the GOP across suburban counties, from Denver to Atlanta, as well as Pittsburgh and Cleveland, it said. The GOP also gained ground in counties around medium-sized cities, such as Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Raleigh, North Carolina, Augusta, Georgia, and Des Moines, Iowa. The data were sourced by political research firm L2 is the name of it, which provided information on 1.7 million voters who likely switched their party affiliations across 42 states. Ladies and gentlemen, this is great news for the Republican Party, obviously very bad news for the Democrat Party. But we know that the Democrat Party always likes to find different ways of getting people to vote. In the Daily Caller, a court strikes down New York City law allowing non-citizens to vote. Since when are non-citizens allowed to vote to begin with? In New York. The New York Supreme Court ruled Monday in favor of a lawsuit against giving non-citizens the right to vote in local elections. So New York State passed a law allowing folks to vote in New York City, and New York City passed it as well, to vote in local elections. And those individuals were illegal aliens. There was a lawsuit, and the New York Supreme Court ruled in favor of the lawsuit, saying, yeah, you can't let people who are here illegally vote. So that's really good news. The Republican National Committee sued New York City Mayor Eric Adams, the New York City Council, and the New York City Board of Elections in January for passing a law allowing non-citizens to vote. So you just heard me talk about how 1 million people across the United States who are citizens changed their party affiliation to Republican. And then what do you have? You have New York City, the brand new mayor that people say is moderate, passing a law that he signs that says now illegals can vote. And if that isn't enough, we also have the problem on the Republican side. Representative Liz Cheney is soliciting votes from Democrats. So Representative Liz Cheney for Republican of Wyoming, is starting to ask Democrats to switch parties and vote for her as she faces a tough primary battle with a candidate endorsed by former President Donald Trump. Cheney's campaign website recently added a section that asks and answers questions about voting. It notes that voters must be registered as a Republican to vote for Cheney in the August 16 primary. That's because, Wyoming has closed primaries. That is to say, if you're a Republican, you can only vote in the Republican primary. And if you're a Democrat, you can only vote in the Democrat primary, all of which is on August 16th. Quote, how do I change my party affiliation to register as a Republican so I can vote for Liz? The website states. In other words, Liz Cheney is soliciting Democrats in her state of Wyoming to change their party affiliation for the sole purpose of making sure that Liz Cheney, a Democrat, stays in power. Can't make that stuff up. Namely, that Liz Cheney, who by all intents and purposes at this point in time is a Democrat, but probably really always has been part of the Uniparty, has decided that she wants to hang on to power. And the only way she can hang on to power is to send out mass mailings, as well as put on her website to Democrats that please, please change your party affiliation. Because if you do change your party affiliation to Republican Democrats, then you can keep me in office, because let's face it, it's going to be a real Republican that gets elected if I lose. That's exactly what Liz Cheney is saying. She's admitting she's not really a Republican, and that a real Republican will ultimately prevail unless enough Democrats switch parties and get her into office because she's really a Democrat. And this is what I would like to call it. I think I'm going to do a podcast about this in the near future, ladies and gentlemen. But I like to call this, it's really kind of the great Republican purge this year. 2022 is really like the year of the great Republican purge. And it's the great Republican purge because it's really the year that I think Republicans are starting to focus more on whether the person representing them in Republican districts is truly a conservative and a Republican, or whether the person that represents them as a Republican is really a Democrat, planning and kind of masquerading as a Republican. That is to say, they come home and they say, oh, the right things. And then they go to Annapolis, or they go to Washington, or they go to your home state capital. And what do? They do the opposite of what they tell you. And I have to say this, all you need to do is look at the Cpac ratings of your local legislative candidates. So in your state legislature, those candidates are rated by Cpac. And at the federal level, they are rated by Cpac. Please look at that, because if you were to do so, you'll see whether the person that you support is really a conservative and therefore should be in the Republican Party, or whether they are actually a Democrat and just using the Republican Party to get elected, like Liz Cheney. And this is important stuff, because 2022 is, and I'm going to do a podcast on this, I can promise you, it really is the year of the great purge in the Republican Party, where you have a kind of a market maker in the party, and that's Trump, no doubt about it, okay? And Trump is calling out the people who are really not interested in making America a constitutional republic again. They're only interested in power, and they're only interested in enriching themselves, and they really have no real conservative principles. In fact, they have no principles whatsoever. And you know who they are, okay? But increasingly, there are more of these people that are being outed, like Liz Cheney. And they're being outed by not just Trump, but by their challengers who are saying, well, wait a minute, why did you vote for that bill? You know, why did you vote for a budget that that put the United States into a situation where we have unsustainable inflation? These are good questions to ask. It's high time that they're asked, and I'm thrilled that there are Republicans across the country who are running as Republicans, but as conservatives as well, and calling out their opponents. And that's it for Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Getter, Truth Social, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.